to go back to how Derrida and Foucault and the so-called postmodernists are labeled as relativists, they're like, even though, like you said, Derrida doesn't necessarily think that there's some final truth that you can arrive at that's eternal and never changes, that doesn't mean that every interpretation of something is equally valid and there are no true statements that are better than any other true statements. Like you were saying, it's not like saying that my lighter exists is the exact same truth statement as saying that my lighter does not exist. So, for example, like, it's not the case, contrary to what members of the IDW say, that, you know, there are all interpretations of Shakespeare's Hamlet are equally valid. There is no interpretation of it that is better than any other interpretation. You could interpret this as being about how aliens are really cool and we should worship aliens, and that's just, that could be considered just as good of an interpretation as any other one. It's more like pluralism. Like, there can be many different valid interpretations of a piece of literature, and some make more sense than others. That's all it is, basically.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there's two things there, isn't there? First of all, going back to your lighter, I mean, what Derrida is saying, and which many philosophers have said, you know, throughout history, is that you can't actually have an unmediated experience of it. Okay, well, so when we're talking about sort of relativism and so forth, you can't actually just get to the lighter itself, because if we had an unmediated relationship to the world, we'd be surprised by every single thing we encounter. You know, you'd be, oh, well, what's that, a lighter? Oh, what's that? Because you wouldn't have the concept of lighter. You wouldn't know what it's for. You wouldn't know how to work it. So, you know, in a basic sense, that's our relationship to the world. It's always mediated through concepts, you know, particularly. You know, we learn all these concepts, and that's how we deal with the world. So that's the first part of it. But yeah, when analyzing pieces of literature, pieces of art, anything, basically, yes, there are more valid analyses than other analyses. You know, if my criticism of a film is just to yell the word cheese for an hour, that's not, you know, that's not going to actually do anything, is it? But the thing is, so you have more or less valid. But what I think the sort of arguments against Derrida tend to go is, well, everyone's going to do that. Everyone's going to yell cheese at the screen for an hour. You know, but that's in a sense to try and stop people doing what they're afraid of, which is bringing in some analyses which are more out there, you know, more, you know, questioning the role of race in Jane Austen, or questioning, you know, how, you know, sexuality happens in the films of Hitchcock and stuff like that. So those are ways of viewing pieces of art that before 68 or whatever, were less common. That, you know, people would just go a fairly standard, you know, this is what the piece of art. I'm cutting out vast amounts of history in that, and you know, and great thinkers. But you know, that's the thing. I do suspect that the people who are arguing against it are saying, well, let's just go back to what we were doing before. Again, I'm saying the same thing, but we go back to what we were doing before and get rid of these, you know, more strange analyses, because some of those strange analyses are just strange and they're no use, and you know, forget them. But some of them hit a mark, reveal something. And you know, I'd much rather 200 people doing ridiculous analyses of Jane Austen and coming up with nothing, and one of them suddenly going, hang on, have you noticed how the people who earn money in this, they're always the males, and they always earn an exact certain amount, and the women are therefore pushed to one side? Isn't that interesting? And suddenly that opens up a whole bunch of stuff. I'd rather that happens than we just go, just analyze Jane Austen in terms of language, and we'll just, that's fine. So, you know, that's the thing. I think, you know, we allowing this doesn't, again, allow for anarchy, you know, because you're not going to get a university thing analyzing, you know, by yelling cheese as you're writing, but you might get it by analyzing the role of race or economics or stuff like that in a particular film.
Yeah. It's funny, when you were mentioning Jane Austen, I was thinking about how I recently watched the movie Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
I haven't seen it. Is it good?
Well, it's exactly what you would expect, basically.
Right.
It's like adding like cheesy zombiness to that world, and I think it's interesting too, because it's that like that's one example of how, you know, adding this bizarre horror concept of zombies, which I think are an awesome and fascinating concept, to Jane Austen can make
Yeah,
people more interested in the ideas in Jane Austen. I mean, full
absolutely.
disclosure, I have copies of Jane Austen books, but I have not read them yet.
Right.
But
Yep.
the but in the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies movie, there are still these themes about the like how much people value class division and marriage and
Mm,
all this sort of stuff, and how
mm,
there is a love story and people are denying that they're in love with each other based on their
yeah.
class division and all
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that's like, you could look at that as this really wild out there interpretation of Jane
Mm,
Austen that
yeah.
still communicates like what are understood to be some of the main themes of it.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, that's an absolutely brilliant example, isn't it? You know, a married couple discussing their future and their land and all that sort of stuff is very different when there's a zombie in the room or a zombie coming
Yeah,
out. You know, isn't it? But it throws things into sharp relief, and I think a lot of, you know, these analyses of, you know, text from the canon, or, you know, whatever they are, being looked at from very different angles does reveal truths about them. And you know, I I love fiction. I love literature, and I think one of the marvelous things about literature, poetry, plays, whatever, is that they are open to new interpretations. That you know, they're not a closed thing, are they? One of the great things about, or any writing, in fact, is that it can continue to live and continue to change. You know, the William Shakespeare of the 16th century, late 16th, early 17th century, is different to the William Shakespeare of the 18th century, is different to the William Shakespeare of the 21st century, because, and I think particularly great pieces are the ones that are more open to more and more interpretations. You know, there's an openness to them, and I think, you know, that's, we're living through an age where a lot of the interpretations now are coming from these new voices that are speaking and saying, well, hang on, you're missing out a whole lot, and that's absolutely terrific. And you know, in 100 years' time, there may be a completely different way of looking at Shakespeare, and you know, some of these issues will have resolved themselves, but you know, robots might be saying, well, where are the robots in Shakespeare? You know, it's about time that they were represented. So who knows?